In this talk, I want to focus on racism, particularly during the pandemic over the past 14, 15 months here in Australia. But I do so when here in Melbourne, we have this morning gone into lockdown, the third one. And so that's been very challenging for the people of Melbourne. And when crises happen in a society, such as with a pandemic or whatever, it generates racism, bigotry, and discrimination. And that's not surprising, because what is usually operating is the scapegoat mechanism. And trying to answer the question, who's responsible for this crisis, for this disaster, which for me may mean that I have to stay locked down in my house, or it may mean even worse, unemployment, hardship, and so on. Separation from my family, who may be overseas, or maybe in another Australian city or up in the country. And during this pandemic, Chinese and Asians generally have been blamed. And this has been brought home because it seems on present evidence, but some people are not convinced of that, and certainly not the Chinese. So that's a part of this issue, and the importance of exercising human solidarity in a mutual obligation to the common good, in combating the risk of exclusion and stigmatization of certain racial and ethnic communities. That as a community, we have to work to protect social connectedness, global connectedness, and work towards the attribute of resilience in addressing this. In Australia, racism has a long history, and it obviously starts with the Aborigines, and thinking during that time was dominated by social Darwinism. This was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and survival of the fittest, of the animals, as they evolved, being applied to human beings. And of course, there was a ladder of superiority nested in social Darwinism, with Indigenous peoples like the Aborigines at the bottom of the ladder, and at the top were the Europeans led by the British and their descendants. So that theory, that racial theory, was very important in the thinking of the British and other European settlers, where they remarked how the Aborigines had never developed the wheel. You used to hear that very common during my boyhood, don't hear it now. Now with COVID-19, we asked Chin Tan, who's the Race Discrimination Commissioner, about how he saw racism over the past 12 to 15 months from his vantage point in the Australian Human Rights Commission. And he said that it was very clear that in the early months, there were many racism attacks against Asian Australians, but more recently, there's been a downward trend. However, the figures are not reliable, not his figures, because there is no single racism database in Australia, because there are other sources, such as the E-Safety Commission, who focuses obviously on online hate mail and so on, state and territory human rights organizations, and the police in each state and territory. But among them all, there is a consensus that there was a rise in the early months of the pandemic against Asian people, particularly Chinese Australians, but as well Korean, Vietnamese, and Australian Muslim communities. And unfortunately, the complaint process in the Australian Human Rights Commission is confidential. And there are many unreported cases. We know this because of lack of awareness of the Racial Discrimination Act and the way to report, fear of the consequences if they do report, and maybe the language ability. The Human Rights Commission has put out protocols and warnings and all that in 63 different languages. Another source is the Scanlon Foundation survey by Professor Andrew Marcus at Monash University. And he also relates that there's been an increase in racism. And he's been measuring it for probably close on 20 years with a yearly survey. Now, mixed up in this also is online hate, which is also linked to conspiracy theories. And there are various conspiracy theories. And one of them relates to replacement theory, which comes out of a French thinker who is appalled by the fact that there are immigrants and refugees have been flooding into Europe since the 1950s. And the replacement theory says that these people from outside Europe are coming in to basically, over the longer term, replace the Europeans. And conspiracy theories generally generate anger, or as we psychologists call it, negative emotionality. And about COVID-19 and its origins, often there's a lot of misinformation linked to conspiracy theories. And this then is picked up by social media and some media narratives, as we have seen. And it sort of behind it is that other people different from us are dangerous. So the World Conference of Religions for Peace advises people, victims, to care for themselves and highlights the importance of bystander action, because it sends a vital message to victims that someone else in the local community cares about them. The Australian Human Rights Commission wants a national anti-racism framework which would have a more common framework across the Australian states. and that it would have a centralized data set. In Australia, as I mentioned before, there's always been fear of the yellow peril. It's deep in the Australian psyche, stemming from really from the gold rush in the 1850s, although there were some Chinese who came to Australia in the 1840s. The fear that there would be hordes of Chinese flowing down, as they did in large numbers during the gold rushes of the 1850s, and for the few decades after that in various places of Australia. And of course, all that led to the White Australia policy, being the third parliamentary act passed by the federal parliament when it met here in Melbourne at the exhibition buildings before they decided to build Canberra. And so that went on, and it was only in the mid-1950s until the early 1970s that we saw the gradual breakdown of the White Australia policy, which was finally ended by Gough Whitlam in the first few weeks of his prime ministership. So those prejudices have gradually been broken down, beginning with the East Timorese coming to Australia and followed quickly by the very large Vietnamese intake. And so in recent decades, we now have huge inflows we have huge inflows of Chinese in the 1990s and soon after by the Indians, who have spread much more widely across Australia than, say, the Chinese and the Vietnamese. We've seen more recently the emergence of racist right-wing extremist groups who are especially opposed to Muslims, and they are anti-Semitic, but they tend to keep that hidden. Of course, the Christchurch massacre was committed by an Australian, Brandon Tarrant, who comes from Grafton up on the north coast of New South Wales, from a very good family. His mother is a secondary school teacher. But he mixed online with these groups. So, and in Australia, I don't think that we've had a proper conversation about that gentleman who now will languish for the rest of his life in a New Zealand jail. The World Conference of Religions for Peace has been giving some thought from very early on, going back a good 12 months, about what religious leaders should be doing. And they emphasized from their New York Secretariat the importance that religious leaders communicate with their communities and the broader society to end misinformation and stigmatization. And secondly, that they combat wrong and dangerous ideas and false rumors. And I think now they have a role to play in combating vaccine hesitancy. I think also that religious communities are able to give hope. Hope in overcoming the dangerous, the crises, in facing something that we don't fully understand and don't know when it's all going to end. Religious communities also, because they operate at the grassroots level, can connect with local, state, national leadership, can help cement the neighborhood. And I think that has been happening, particularly during lockdown, that the role of our neighbors and the neighborhood has become more important. Because at the moment, during this lockdown, I can't travel more than 5 kilometers from here in my house. And it's at that local level where religious leadership can play a definite role. So we're treating of a vast subject when we talk about racism, and when we apply it to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's good to look at what's happened in the past and how religious and other local communities, as well as political leaders, the role that they can play in combating racism, scapegoating, and so on. So thank you very much. And I hope that all of you will do your part in combating racism, prejudice, discrimination. Thank you.